Good evening. I want to thank, first and foremost, MatchLab, Dan Schneider, and of course, our last panelist, Joseph Humire, who put together this panel on Venezuela this year. Obviously, Venezuela is a very, very important issue. It was probably last year as well, but this year, even more so, a hot-button issue. But the interesting thing about the coverage of Venezuela is that it is overly simplified in news headlines as an internal series of events. You have extreme poverty followed by humanitarian crisis. We see the images of the children, the people who are dumpster diving, and that is all a reality. But it is a very small part of the reality of the political reality of Venezuela to just look at what's going on internally. So what we've done here today is put together a panel of experts with diverse backgrounds and expertise, and each one of them will fill in one of the puzzle pieces to give you a bigger and broader picture of the real crisis and the external factors that have led to the reality of the Venezuelan crisis today. I'd like to introduce you to our panel members. Now, next to me is Mr. Gordon Chang, who is the author of Nuclear Showdown, North Korea Takes on the World, released by Random House in 2006. It focuses on nuclear proliferation in general and the North Korean crisis. His first book, The Coming Collapse of China, 2001. He's lived and worked in China and Hong Kong for almost 2 decades, most recently in Shanghai as counsel to the American law firm Paul Weiss, and also in Hong Kong, and he is also a columnist at the Daily Beast. Next, we have, who do we have? Ilan Berman is a senior vice president of the American Foreign Policy Council in Washington. He's an expert on regional security in the Middle East, Central Asia, Russia, and he's consulted for both the U.S. CIA and the Department of Defense, and has provided assistance on foreign policy and national security issues to a range of government agencies and congressional offices. And he's been called one of America's leading experts on the Middle East and Iran by CNN.
Love that. I concur.
Next, we have Mike Pregent, who's a senior fellow at the Hudson Institute. He is a former intelligence officer with over 30 years' experience working security, terrorism, counterterrorism, policy issues, Middle East, North Africa, Southwest Asia. He has numerous publications on ISIS, Iran's Quds forces, and on Syria and Iraq. And his writings have been published in the Washington Post, Foreign Affairs, Wall Street Journal, and Foreign Policy magazine. And he frequently appears as an expert analyst on BBC, CNN, and Fox News. And last but not least is Joseph Humire, a national security expert focused on Latin America. He regularly briefs the Defense Department and regional governments on transnational threats networks in the region. He is a former Marine, tours in Iraq and Latin America, and recently came back from Brazil and Colombia. He's going to talk to us a little bit about that, where he briefed senior members of the military on the crisis in Venezuela. He publishes regularly for Fox News, Breitbart, Washington Times, Hill, Small Wars Journal, among others, and he is a frequent national security commentator with major Spanish and English media, including Univision, Telemundo, CNN Español, Fox News, and Canada's CTV, and he is the co-editor of Iran's Strategic Penetration of Latin America. The bios are long because so is the level of expertise of our panel members. So without further ado, I want to start with you, Ilan. This morning I actually moderated a different panel on Syria. And in doing so and preparing the questions for both panels, realized how there are so many lessons that can be taken from what happened in Syria, and also so many parallels that exist between the two. Maybe you can touch upon, not many people know about the broad tentacles of the Russians and the Iranians have within Venezuela, because they're also busy in Syria, but they divide up their time pretty well. Can you speak a little bit about that influence?
Sure. No, I think that's a great question, and it's a great place to start. There's a tremendous amount of similarity right? The old saying is that history doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes. And the way the Russians in particular, also the Iranians, have exploited empty political space in Latin America looks an awful lot like the way they've exploited empty political space in the Middle East. And a lot of this, frankly, can be laid at the feet of the last administration. John Kerry, when he was Secretary of State, gave a speech in November of 2013 before the Organization of the American States in Washington, D.C. And this was the famous or infamous end of the Monroe Doctrine speech, in which he essentially said that under Obama, there is going to be a kinder or gentler American polity towards the Western Hemisphere, and that we were not going to impose our ideas. We were essentially going to stand back and listen. And the way this was perceived in Moscow, in Tehran, in Beijing, was slightly different, I think, than the way the Obama administration intended it to be. It was that America's leaving. America is departing. America's retracting its influence. And so in the years that followed, up until today, you've seen an expansion of external actors in Latin America. In particular, but not only, Russia, China, and Iran. They're doing different things, they're operating differently, but there's a lot of similarities, particularly with how the Russians think about the Western Hemisphere and what they're trying to do, with how they think about their geopolitical position in Syria, and how they've essentially exploited the vacuum that was created there by the last administration to improve their position and to do so at our expense.
So how do the Russians view Venezuela in particular?
So I think it's useful to the proper lens, I think, is not just Venezuela, it's Latin America as a whole. If you look at the pattern of Russian behavior in the Western Hemisphere, the Russians are back to Cold War era tactics, including long-range reconnaissance flights by strategic bombers, including the penetration of vulnerable states in our hemisphere, in our periphery. That requires a greater degree of influence, a greater degree of economic and political penetration in countries that are close to the United States than they had previously, right? So you had a period in the 1990s of Russian retraction. Russia had an economic meltdown. They weren't doing that well. You had a more modest foreign policy. That's a thing of the past. The Russians increasingly are thinking globally once again, and the way they look at not only Venezuela, but also countries like Nicaragua and Bolivia is very much in that vein, which is they're chess pieces as part of a larger chessboard, but the main adversary, the opposite number, is the United States.
You know, Mike, I want to move on to you with a similar question, but you know, with the influence of Iran in Venezuela is not as it's not as passive. They have actively set up terror networks. They have, you know, obviously have shown their nefarious activities there. And with the obviously close proximity that Ilan also touched upon to our southern border, you know, what is this added calculation that we have to make with the presence of Iran? How does Iran view Venezuela, and why has it taken such an interest in Venezuela over the last few years?
Well, thanks for having me on the panel, and it's a pleasure to be here with my esteemed colleagues. Venezuela has become so important to the Islamic Republic of Iran because if Maduro falls, it portends what might happen in Iran. The Islamic Republic is looking at Venezuela through a lens. How active would the United States be in supporting an opposition that may actually topple a leader that's very similar with regime practices? You mentioned the conglomerate of militias, the collectivo, that they've set up. This is a group of about 30 militias that have been trained directly by Iran's the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps' Basij Corps. So the Basij basically goes out and forces people to adhere to social norms that the government wants to put in place, but also intimidates them. And it's a way to oppress the population. The thing about Venezuela that's so important, not only is the Islamic Republic, the regime, looking at Venezuela to see whether or not it survives, the Iranian opposition is looking at Venezuela and looking to see what they need to do in order to get U.S. support. I don't believe it's a mistake that you could read 5,000 troops to Colombia that was on Bolton's notepad when he was talking about Venezuela. I think that the United States is messaging not only the Islamic Republic, but also the opposition. Get together, get a leader like Guaido in Venezuela, and the United States might be able to do something. Get together and give us somebody we can support. And it's also a message to the regime. Look what we can do if we build a coalition. If you look at all the countries that are actually supporting Guaido and the countries that are supporting or that are anti-Maduro, you can easily see which countries support Maduro. And it's basically America's geopolitical foes. And everyone's looking at Venezuela because if it falls, it portends what may happen in other places. I was offered a job at Southcom in 2011. Southcom is the United States Army Southern Command that looks at Central America and South America. And I'm a Middle East guy. I said, why do you want me to look at Central and South America? And it was because of Iran's activities. The Lebanese Hezbollah is there. The IRC Quds Force is there. They have strategic interests in what happens not only in Venezuela, but other places as well. I'm also from El Paso, Texas. And if you look at the construction of the tunnels, and I've spent time in Arizona as well, you see the level of sophistication in building these underground tunnels to not only smuggle drugs, but also arms back and forth between Mexico and the United States. It has a Lebanese Hezbollah footprint. It has a direct tie to the cartels. So this is bigger than Venezuela. It is all about Venezuela at the same time, but Venezuela is key to messaging the Islamic Republic, the opposition, and also giving the opposition in Iran a way to look at how to organize properly. And I'll leave it there.
You know, and along the same veins, what happens in these times of crisis in the political vacuum is not only do you get the nefarious actors and the radicalism, but Gordon, moving to you, we have the emergence of these proxy wars. So you have actors like China who like to stay in the shadows, all of a sudden emerging them and heavily inserting themselves in these proxy wars. If you can comment a bit about China's interest in Venezuela.
Yeah, when I was listening to Ilan speak, I was thinking, well, you could take much of what he said and just take out the word Russia and put in China, and you'd have an accurate description, especially because you have the Russians and the Chinese now cooperating in terms of supporting Maduro. So for instance, 36 hours ago, you had both China and Russia veto a U.S.-sponsored resolution on Venezuela, and that shows the coordination of the policies of Beijing and Moscow when it comes to try to penetrating this region. Taking the thoughts of Joseph, for instance, and this whole concept of proxy wars, what you see are the Chinese, as well as the Russians, trying to exploit that vacuum and to be able to create disturbances in this hemisphere in a way to try to distract the United States. And so, for instance, you see a couple things that mirror what the Russians are doing. So, for instance, you have the Russian military involvement in Caracas, the Russian blackjack bombers that landed in near Caracas and actually buzzed the U.S. West Coast as they were on their way back to Russia. Well, the Chinese have a military presence in Venezuela as well, but we're not going to see probably Chinese bombers land there anytime soon, but they don't really need to because China and Russia are coordinating their policies. But we do see, for instance, an important Chinese satellite tracking station and a Venezuelan military base, and that shows you Beijing trying to insert itself into this. The other important aspect of China's proxy war is really, as they support Maduro, they need to put money in there. Russia has lent money to the Maduro regime, or Chavez-Maduro regimes. China has as well, in a big way, perhaps as much as $62 billion in total. Now, right now, the outstanding balance is somewhere between $10 or $25 billion, depending on who you talk to. Some people say more. But the point is, the Chinese, as late as September, have started to reverse the process and now are putting even more money into the Maduro regime. We saw that additional $5 billion credit line. So this is an ongoing policy on the part of Beijing to get into our region, to distract us. The proxy war analogy, I think, is the right one. And really, it goes down to that one point that you mentioned, Ilan, and that is the Obama administration's renunciation of the Monroe Doctrine. Thank God that Secretary Tillerson reversed that. We now have a policy of opposing neocolonialism in our region by extra-hemispheric actors. And when we talk about extra-hemispheric actors, of course it's Iran, but it's Russia and China.
So now, as we're piecing together the different external factors, Joseph, I want to turn to you. As probably the foremost expert on Venezuela on this panel, as somebody who understands the micro and the macro, if you could bring this all together for us, if you can connect all the dots to say, how far are Russia, China, Iran, Turkey willing to go to prop up the Maduro regime, and how should that, in effect, then factor into U.S. foreign policy on Venezuela?
Yeah, well, first of all, let me just say thank you to the organizers, Matt Schlapp and Dan Schneider, for organizing this panel, to have a panel on Venezuela. And not just one panel, actually 2 panels. There'll be another one tomorrow on Venezuela at CPAC, I think is an incredible thing. And I've learned a lot from my colleagues over the years, particularly Ilan. We co-edited a book, learned a lot from Michael and his writings about the Middle East. Gordon, I read religiously every week. And Lisa, I always watch her on TV. So to me, the concept of the panel and the question, Lisa, is really to understand what we're fighting against in Venezuela. And that's the concept. Fundamentally, in Venezuela, we're not just fighting the Maduro regime. I think that's something the United States needs to understand. To topple Maduro, there's many scenarios when Maduro can go and nothing changes. Everything stays exactly the same, because the undercurrent that brought Maduro to power has a lot to do with what my fellow speakers just said. I think in analogy, I mean, if you want to ask me how far were they willing to go to defend Maduro, well, I could throw it back and say, how far are they willing to go to defend Bashar al-Assad? And what we learned from the Syria conflict is that the only reason Bashar al-Assad is in power is because of his alliances. If he did not have those alliances, he would have been gone a long time ago, because there's multiple threats, not just from rebels, but also there's terrorist threats against him as well. So I traveled to Latin America quite a bit in my work as a scholar. And one of the things I do is I try to tell the Latin Americans about the connectivities with the Middle East. But I like to do that through a story. And I want to share that story with you. And I want you to visualize who I'm talking about. And imagine I'm in Latin America, I'm in Brazil, or I'm in Colombia, and I tell this story. And I tell this story about a lieutenant colonel, right? A lieutenant colonel that has tremendous military ambitions, that tried to overthrow his country by force, but failed. Then later, actually got elected as president. Immediately when he became elected, he nationalized his natural resources. And he used the profits from those natural resources, particularly petroleum, to create a revolution. The revolution captured his government, used the government to capture the country, then used the country to export throughout the region. All the while accusing his enemies, both domestic and foreign, of imperialism, and saying that they were trying to impose Western-style capitalism on his country. He died after 14 years of office of natural causes, but not before leaving a legacy of crime and corruption. So I tell that story in Latin America, and everybody thinks I'm talking about Lieutenant Colonel Hugo Chavez, but I'm not. I'm talking about Lieutenant Colonel Gamal Abdel Nasser, because the stories are identical. And why are they identical? Because the undercurrent that put Bashar al-Assad into power in Syria is the same undercurrent that put first Chavez and now Maduro into power in Venezuela. It's the concept of trans-regional threat networks. And that's something that's a kind of a wonky term for defense and intelligence folks. But what it means is the world's a lot smaller than what we think it is. And the folks that are working to fight Venezuela are the same folks that are working to fight in Syria, to fight in Iran, to fight in Ukraine, to fight in the South China Sea. We're fighting the same war. But it's not a conventional war, and I guarantee that these folks aren't going to fight us with just their military forces. They're going to use every asymmetric tool in their toolbox to destabilize their regions in order to delegitimize the United States.
Joseph, I'm going to ask you a follow-up question with what you said in terms of how far are they going to go to prop up the Bashar al-Assad regime. You and I had a conversation way back when, when we made the comparison and said, well, the weakening of Bashar al-Assad has actually helped the external players. So in this case, when we are looking at the toppling of Maduro as the end-all be-all victory in Venezuela in the short term, could that analogy apply also to Venezuela to say, well, the weakening of Maduro is only going to make these external nefarious players even stronger?
Yeah. So I will answer the question, but I actually want to punt it to Ilan, because me and Ilan have spent a lot of time talking about that comparison, particularly with Assad, and I think Ilan's much more knowledgeable about what happened in Syria. And maybe you could address the Russians.
What humble panel.
I'm happy to.
I will answer.
We'll ping-pong it back and forth. No, listen, I think the similarities are actually really glaring, at least in the context of Russia. It's not an exaggeration to say that Russia is following a Syria model in Venezuela. If you look at what happened and sort of what Russia was thinking when it intervened in Syria in September of 2015, right? Russia was trying to achieve essentially three things. Russia was trying to improve its military position because it was at risk of losing its foothold in the eastern Mediterranean because it looked like the Bashar al-Assad regime was going to fall. Russia was trying to change the political conversation because by then it had been at war with Ukraine for about 14 months and things weren't going very well, quite candidly, or at least not as well as the Kremlin wanted. And Russia was trying to externalize its Islamist problem, right? Then that's a longer conversation. Russia has an Islamist problem. Russia's Muslims are the single largest minority in the country. They are radicalizing, they're mobilizing, and a lot of them went to the Middle East. So, one little sort of nuanced tidbit was at the height of its power in about 2015, Russian was the third most frequently spoken language in the caliphate in Iraq and Syria, in the territories under ISIS control. Right? Russia has a problem. So all these things sort of combined, and the Russians went to Syria because the best defense is a good offense. And in much the same way, the Russians are thinking now about Venezuela, are thinking about the potential loss of equities if the United States succeeds, if Guaido succeeds, and Russia sees reconfiguring the table in Venezuela as a great way to stand athwart the United States and to prevent American interest from expanding in the Western Hemisphere.
Yeah, that's exactly in line what I was thinking, and I think just to very simply state it is that a weaker Maduro provides more leverage for Russia and China in the United Nations. So it allows them to leverage Venezuela in ways that can actually gain benefits in Syria, in Ukraine, and in other places. So they're playing that kind of geopolitical game. I want to say one other thing to that, which is that I think the Syria analogy is very relevant, not just because of the networks, but also just in the understanding of how Syria has devolved essentially into a failed state. In Syria, if you were to describe it in one sentence, and I know Ilan, Michael, and Gordon could describe it probably better than I can, but I would describe it as a humanitarian crisis that exacerbated one of the worst refugee outflows in the world, particularly for Europe, that compounded with counterterrorism problems that led to the pretty much omnipresence of Russia, Iran, and now increasingly Turkey. That definition now fits Venezuela, and that's not by accident, because Venezuela has become, in some sense, of a proxy. I think the concept of proxy war is very adequate here, to be able to leverage their greater global interests. And I think that's where we have to start this conversation of Venezuela. It's not all about just having Maduro leave or come and go. I think that's a very simplistic way to look at the crisis.
Joseph, you talk about this whole idea of leveraging, Russia and China leveraging their way because of the crisis. The one thing that the United States shouldn't do is to invite the Russians and the Chinese to have some participation in the settlement of the end of the Maduro regime. And there are many American policymakers, such as Tony Blinken, former Obama Deputy Secretary of State, who's been talking about, let's bring in the Russians and the Chinese and let's all settle this. You have two malign actors for the reasons that Joseph's been talking about. And when you're trying to transition to democracy, who do you want to bring in? Russia and China? I mean, this just makes no sense at all.
But is there a way to work around these players? I mean, we weren't able to do that in Syria, and perhaps it was because of failed leadership here in the United States for the past decade. But is there a way to do that? And you actually segued into my next question, which is to ask the broader question: is the Trump administration handling or pushing for the right policy in Venezuela? But if you can start by saying, could we leave the players out?
Well, I think that you have to try at least to get them out, because they, as we've all been talking about, are the actors that have made, Venezuela into Joseph's famous phrase, like the Syria of the Western Hemisphere. And I think that we can. You see the Trump administration not talking to Moscow and Beijing about some sort of negotiated settlement, which is a good thing. We're working with our partners and friends, with the Lima Group, with Europeans, everybody. We're not really having this vital conversation, as many people would want it to be, with the Chinese and the Russians. So I think the Trump administration policy is good in that regard. And one of the things you want to do is chase out the bad guys, and I think that we have a lot of leverage because the Chinese and Russians have, for instance, all of these loan obligations that they're not going to get paid. They're all going to be tossed out of their military bases. I think that the Trump administration just makes it very clear, we're more powerful in this region than you are, and you guys are gone.
Yeah, I want to ask the rest of you to also comment that's great.
I have one fan in the audience.
You have many, many, many fans. I'm very sure of that. If we could very quickly, I'd like for all of you to comment on that. I think that's an important point to make here. Is the Trump administration handling foreign policy in Venezuela the way it should?
Look, so I think at the end of the day, there's no substitute for seriousness. And it's a bipartisan failure, right, Republicans and Democrats, of paying too little attention to the Western Hemisphere. We've tended to take for granted that we can't improve our position and that the region is politically problematic, but really there's nothing that we can do to change it. The Russians don't think this. The Chinese don't think this. Even the Iranians don't think this. They think they can improve their position and improve it at our expense. So what Gordon said, I think, applies exactly, which is that we, because we're geographically closer, because our economy is more robust, because frankly we have more dog in the fight, we have more skin in the game, we have to convey to Moscow and to Beijing and to Tehran that we care more about the disposition of the Western Hemisphere than they do. We haven't yet, right? And I think that's a failure. And to the extent the Trump administration can show through word and through deed that it really cares about the political trajectory of Latin America as a whole, frankly, I think that more than anything else will put Moscow and Tehran and Beijing on their heels.
Right. Michael?
Well, what I would say is unfortunately, our adversaries have a different clock than we do. There's 612 days until the election, and our adversaries are waiting out that clock. If the president is reelected, we reset that clock. If he's not, that's what they're hoping for. And when I say that, we see it with North Korea, we see it with Iran, we see it with Russia, we see it with China. Every one of the countries that are trying to keep Maduro afloat have a consistent 30-year, at least, strategic policy to do the things they're doing. We change out every 2 years, every 2 to 4 years. And I think our adversaries are trying to wait out the clock. The good thing about this Venezuela issue is this is Trump's. This is his. It's not something he inherited. It's something that we're actually going in, and he's saying all the right things, and it's a great message, again, to our adversaries. You can communicate to our adversaries through Venezuela, what you're saying. The thing is, there's got to be tangible steps that take place because we only have 20 months to do something about this.
And Michael, because this is your area of expertise, I just want to ask, should there be U.S. military presence in Venezuela?
There should be U.S. military presence around Venezuela, ready to support Venezuela opposition with all the things. We have to mirror what Russia and China and Iran are doing there. We don't want to allow S-400s to get into Venezuela. We've seen the Iranian Navy send ships as far south as Venezuela. We need to not be afraid to be a superpower. I don't understand why a country that's a superpower with a $19 trillion economy is worried about a Russian $1.9 trillion economy and an Iranian shrinking $400 billion economy. We need to start acting like a superpower.
Yeah. Joseph.
Well, just to quickly piggyback off what Michael's saying, I think as a superpower that we have to flex not just conventional force, we have to flex asymmetric force, because this is not a conventional conflict. We're not going to win this with military forces in Latin America or anywhere else for that matter. But let me say, I know firsthand that the Trump administration has cared about Venezuela even before he was inaugurated as the President of the United States. I was actually asked by the transition team to come in and talk about Venezuela in the period before he was inaugurated as president. So this, for many people, this kind of woke up in the last few months. But for the administration, they've been involved in this from day one and trying to understand what's going on in Venezuela, trying to plan for a variety of contingencies. So let me say first the good, and then I'll try to give a fair criticism of what I think the administration is doing right now in Venezuela. The good is that with all the work that's been done since the beginning of the administration, we're on a different timeline now. Before, in the previous administration, we always reacted to what Hugo Chavez or Nicolas Maduro did. They ran the clock. They would dictate when they were going to dissolve a government body, when they were going to lock up a political prisoner, when they were going to incite a riot, and everybody else would just react. If you paid attention to the last 2 months, it's not like that anymore. They are now reacting to things that the United States is doing in conjunction with the Lima Group and others. So we've, and use a basketball analogy, we've taken over the court. So I think that's good. I think the United States is in this game now, and they're playing, I think, for keeps. I mean, I don't think this is a bluff. My criticism is that I think we need to be consistent. Right? So if you look at the failures of proxy wars in the past, and the United States hasn't won every proxy war, I think we have kind of a mixed record on that, going back to Vietnam, is we don't always do the best job at picking the right side. I know you guys can talk a lot about Syria and all the different actors in Syria, and who everyone wants to look for the unicorn, right? That perfect, shiny, pro-American group that's in a country that's going to just export the values and do everything. They don't usually exist. There are no unicorns. And I think why we need to be consistent is as we talk about, the president gave a speech in Miami, as we talk about the socialism versus freedom, we have to be very consistent on the folks that we work with to understand who's the undercurrent that's pushing it back against socialism. What I like to do, I like to recognize some folks that are actually in the room that came with me to the event, and other folks that are probably watching on the video cameras. There are individuals in Venezuela that have worked consistently for several years to promote a pro-freedom, a pro-capitalist, a pro-free market message. Some of those individuals are, if you could stand up, are a group called Rumbo Libertad, which means Path to Liberty. Who have consistently worked to promote a free market message and a pro-American message in the country. There's also Maria Corina Machado, who's a politician, and her movement of Vente Venezuela, who is. So the Guaido administration is I think we have to back it. It is the legitimate constitutional government of Venezuela, but we need to steer them away from socialism. Because in Venezuela, there's a lot of socialist forces pushing them back in. And we have to make sure that their narrative stays consistent with the president's narrative and doesn't start to talk about this isn't about ideology and it's just about democracy. Because democracy without liberty is nothing. It means nothing. The first guy that did democratic socialism in the Western Hemisphere was Hugo Chavez. He gave his people democracy and he took away their liberty. And so he gave them participatory elections and said they could vote, and then slowly took away everything else. So I think we have to be consistent in who the people we pick, how we work with them, and build that broader coalition, and not let that coalition drag us into another form of socialism in Venezuela that's going to just drain and repeat the cycle over and over. That's how we got here.
We need to have Jeff Bezos move his Amazon headquarters to Caracas.
That would help.
I want to give just maybe Mike, Ilan, and Gordon last thoughts to end the panel, and then maybe do we have time for Q&A here? We have, that's 5 minutes for Q&A? How many questions do we have from the audience? Okay, Ilan, Dan, Gordon, you guys lose your time. Everyone else, we'll take the questions from the audience. Yes.
Can you speak on the circumstances, any of you who want to participate in this question, I'd appreciate it. Can you please speak to the Obama administration's decision to end Project Cassandra through the Justice Department while they were working with to accomplish the Iran deal, and what its impact has been throughout Latin America, but also here in the United States?
I could probably speak of that since I worked a lot with our military and law enforcement on looking at drug trafficking networks from Hezbollah. So for those that aren't familiar, Project Cassandra was a DEA project, an operation that actually targeted Hezbollah drug trafficking networks and money laundering networks that were rampant throughout Latin America. They made a lot of inroads looking at these projects tying there was an operation called Titan that actually arrested a Lebanese Colombian individual named Iman Juma, who was trafficking multi-ton shipments of cocaine through a used car racket, laundering the money through a used car racket, and giving all the illicit proceeds to the war chest of Hezbollah. And so that operation was one of the biggest money laundering operations in Latin America and kind of was a success for Project Cassandra. So when they tried to capitalize on the arrest of Iman Juma and they tried to focus on more other critical nodes of that criminal network, they got a lot of pushback. Particularly from different government agencies, State Department one, and they just didn't understand why. And I think what I like to do is to simplify it very quickly. The legacy of the last president, of Barack Obama, in terms of foreign policy was many things, but two things in particular. It was a renegotiation, a reset with Cuba, and it was a nuclear deal with Iran. The country that paid the price for that failed foreign policy is Venezuela, based on what we're talking about. Cuba and Iran, among the other actors, have entrenched themselves more because of that failed vision of what we could look at in the prospect of Latin America. So Cassandra, the Hezbollah stuff, was one piece of it. The reason why some people think, I'm not asserting that, but some people think that there was a pass given to Hezbollah in Latin America was because there was a bigger picture to try to get to the finish line on the nuclear deal with Iran. And so therefore, it was kind of just, we'll turn a blind eye to some of the other stuff until we could get to that finish line.
What's your comment on the inflation issue in Venezuela, which I've heard reports is outrageous, I mean, hundreds of thousands of %.
I think, Ilan, is that you?
I've heard that China, the debt trapping that China's done involves a very long-term lease on a fair degree of oil in Venezuela. So, brief comment, those are complex questions, but the economic situation is the inflation in China's ownership of oil. What's that look like?
Well, the oil-backed loans, basically China has been able to reduce its exposure to Venezuela because it's been receiving payment in oil. And that, of course, has made it very difficult for Venezuela then to sell oil on the international markets in order to fund a number of other purposes. So this has really been very difficult for Venezuela just because the Chinese have been really tough on both Chavez and Maduro, and it's going to continue. So especially as the price of oil changes, the Chinese have tried to renegotiate these things, and that has led to even more misery, and that is causing those economic dislocations you talked about.
Could I just throw in just 10 seconds? Because I think this is a really important macro point. When you look at Russia and China and Iran, you are looking at increasingly insolvent economic actors, right? You have a cooling Chinese economy. You have a Russia where commodity prices are rising. You have an Iran where the national currency, the Iranian rial, has effectively cratered over the last year. And yet all of those countries are pouring money into Venezuela. It's not because they think they're going to get a return on their investment. It's because they see Venezuela as a geopolitical project, right? And if you start talking about it only in market terms, this doesn't make any sense. But if you talk about it as a political project, as a stake in an anti-American alliance, it makes much more sense.
I'm going to steal 1 minute. I'm sorry. Just because on the economic point, the country you really want to pay attention to now is Turkey, because in the last year, 23.6 tons of gold has been literally plunged out of Venezuela and exported to Turkey. Now, the excuse that the regime is giving is that we're going to move our recertification of our gold from Switzerland to Turkey, and we're going to create a certification company in Turkey so that we can export the gold elsewhere. That was a year ago. The gold hasn't gone anywhere. But what we have seen is a correlation between the strength of the lira and the imports of Venezuelan gold into Turkey, which could lead to a kind of commodity-backed monetary system that would peg away from the US dollar. So there's an element of economic warfare that's being played us here as well with Turkey, Russia, who have inflation problems of their own, and they're, I think, using the Venezuelan crisis as a way to be able to solve their own economic problems.
Unfortunately, I'm getting the message from the back of the room that that's all the time that we have. Thank you very much to our esteemed panel members and to all of you. Thank you.